Welcome to Talking with Tech. I'm your host, Rachel Madel, joined as always by Chris Bouguet. Hey, Chris.
Hey, Rachel. What's going on?
Not much. What do you got for me this week?
Well, Rachel, I think years ago when we first started this podcast, I know a principle of mine that I think we share is that this podcast would not just be informative, but it would also be fun, right? There'd be a level of edutainment to our content so that people didn't ever feel like it was taking their medicine. Oh, I got to listen to the Talking with Tech podcast. No, like, oh my gosh, it's fun. Let's listen to the Talking with Tech podcast. Let's see what kind of wackiness, still respectful wackiness, but still, some sort of fun way to learn new content. So with that in mind, you and I have to pull pranks on each other over the years. But then we also try and do some fun things. And I think this one is one of those fun, little, weird, wacky things that might be really useful, but also in a very fun way.
All right. I'm super excited. You always have these fun things in store. I never know what this roller coaster ride is going to be like, but I'm buckling in. I'm ready.
So a few days ago, we were working on a slide deck together, and I sent you a little comment in Google Slides that said, okay, open this up and go to full screen and then arrow through the next 5 slides. And if you don't laugh out loud on slide 5, then I owe you a beverage the next time we get together, right? And so tell me what happened on your end.
So on my end, I was like, what is this scavenger hunt I am going on right now? And indeed, I did laugh out loud when I got to slide number 5 of our presentation.
Yeah, so what I embedded was this little project I have been working on, which is creating animated GIFs of myself. So the one that you happen to see, in fact, the vast majority that I've created so far were a project I was working on with my daughter, Maggie. And the way that happened is you remember the Disney episodes? Well, we were standing in line at Disney killing time, and I was like, I want to make animated GIFs of myself. I had made one a long time ago of me tapping my watch, and now I send it to the kids all the time when, I'm waiting to pick them up, and I'll just send that GIF, or whatever, hey, we're all in the car waiting for you. Put your stuff on, get out here. I send that GIF. So I said, what if we created more of these and I could slide these into presentations occasionally, but then there's some elements here, like I want to make sure the background is removed so it's slick, you don't see some sort of, line full of people in Disney, right? So Maggie and I made a bunch of animated GIFs, meaning she recorded these little videos on her phone, and then I later on turned them into animated GIFs. If you will give me a second here, we will take the video I'm about to show so you can see it, but I'm going to show you a collage of the animated GIFs. So this is really a visual piece on an audio podcast, but I got to show you just so you can see what it looks like. So here we go. I'm going to share my screen. And you can see here, Rachel, that I'm logged into the website Giphy, GIPHY.com. Now, you and I have talked about using GIFs for a long time. What are some ways you use GIFs in your practice?
I'm obsessed with GIFs. I feel like I use them for sure weekly, but almost daily. And there's so many different ways to use them. What I love about them the most is that they're very novel and they're super fun. So, if I'm in a classroom and I'm watching a teacher talk about the weather, right? That's a very common thing we see, especially in preschool classrooms. It's like, what's the weather today? It's like we can take anything that feels kind of boring and we could type something into Giphy and find some type of GIF. So speaking about the weather, it's like, okay, I'm observing this teacher. Some of the ideas I have is like, hey, when we're talking about it raining, let's type that into Giphy and get a torrential downpour, or someone being, having 5 umbrellas that they're holding, something that's really interesting and fun and novel. And so I feel like that's just one way I use it, but there's a ton of ways to use this. When you have a student with very limited interest, Chris has just typed in rain on Giphy, and I'm now looking at all the fun different ways that we can, again, demonstrate this, get kids talking, get kids laughing, get kids engaged. One of the other things I was going to share is, if you have students with limited interests, which many of our students, it feels like it's really hard to get them motivated, but they have one specific interest or curiosity, you can really do a deep dive on Giphy. So I have a student who is really into Angry Birds. So you guessed it. You were like, I have a student. I do also have a student that's really into ceiling fans. But Angry Birds is, this student's favorite thing. And so there's so many different GIFs when you type in Angry Birds, and you can see all of the different communication opportunities there. And so it's such a great resource, so many different ways to kind of create opportunities for language. And especially when we're getting our kids to kind of think outside of just nouns, getting them to use verbs and all different types of core language, GIFs are just a really easy, fun way to do it.
Yeah, you said it. I mean, you could type in a core vocabulary word and see how it's expressed through a GIF. One little side note here is that we probably wouldn't go to Giphy, and I bet you a lot of schools it's blocked, and search because you might find something inappropriate. But I think what we're suggesting is you could do that on your own, get a handful of these, and then embed them into a slide deck or something like that so that students can find them. And of course, there are older learners that we support that we could do an actual search. But if we're talking about schools, you wouldn't necessarily want to go here because occasionally you might get that inappropriate thing. But certainly by looking at them ahead of time.
I was going to say one more thing, Chris. So yes, you're absolutely right. Sometimes the search can be really dangerous. So I definitely wouldn't recommend doing it in front of students. You can save those images to your phone or some type of other resource. And so myself and my clinicians, my whole team has a shared GIF album that we can just pull up on our phone. We constantly add to it. The other thing is I have resources where we've done the legwork for you. So core language, lots of opportunities. We have slide decks that I sell on my website that have a bunch of GIFs that are super fun. So yeah, that's definitely what I would recommend is kind of pre-screen the GIFs so that you're able to make sure there's nothing inappropriate in there. But yeah, it's a really great tool.
Now, another principle that we've talked about on this podcast, and I take it to heart, and I think everybody should take this to heart, is that occasionally when you go to try and find a resource and you can't find a particular resource, like maybe there are the core vocabulary word you're searching for, or that unique concept that you're going to search for is not there, then you know what that means. It means it's on you to create it. The world needs you to create it because clearly it was a resource that wasn't available. So that you turn that camera right around and you say, I'm going to create that. And that means you could be the one that creates an animated GIF to start filling that need. And what I'm about to show you, Rachel, is some of the animated GIFs that I made. You ready? Here we go.
I'm super excited. I feel like they're going to be ridiculous, and I was correct. This is so good.
So if you go to giphy.com/channel/Christopher Bugay, we'll put that in the show notes, you should be able to see the Chris Bugay collection of animated GIFs that you can take and you can pop into your presentations or whatever. Now, I've just only started. I've got, maybe 11 or 12 GIFs here. The original time one that you could add. But feel free to use these open source. So with that said, what would you like to learn how I made one?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, it's actually, the steps are pretty simple, but that said, let's wait till next time. Let's come back and spend our entire banter going through the process of how to make an animated GIF of yourself or of something, really any video you create. So Rachel, tell us about the interview today.
Chris, I had the pleasure of interviewing Theresa Bartolotta, and we talked all about Rett syndrome, which I don't know, how many of our listeners have students with Rett syndrome. I've definitely worked with some students with Rett syndrome, and we go into lots of details. I figured it was a really great episode to share because, low incidence disabilities are sometimes challenging, and oftentimes we feel kind of stuck with some of those cases where there's not a lot of clear information and there's some commonalities. So I thought it was a really great interview, and I'm really excited to share the interview that I did with Theresa.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adriana Zabala, and I am one of the daughters of Joy Zabala. My mother was a pioneer in the field of assistive technology and a tremendous advocate for ensuring that educational experiences were designed to be inclusive, equitable, and accessible. Throughout her life, my mother understood that mentorship of the next generation was essential in order to realize enduring, sustainable change. To further my mom's work, her family, friends, and colleagues created the Joy Zabala Fellowship. Inspired by my mom's passion for empowering emerging practitioners, the fellowship supports relationships between experienced professionals and those who are taking the initial steps in their journey toward building a more inclusive future. I would like to invite you to participate in supporting this work by applying to become either a mentor or a mentee. You can access the applications and learn how to participate by going to joyzabala.com. I look forward to working with you to carry on my mother's work as we endeavor together to put more joy in the world for everyone.
Welcome to Talking with Tech. I'm your host, Rachel Madel, joined today by Theresa Bartolotta. Thank you so much for coming, Theresa. I'm really excited to have you here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Rachel. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Okay, so just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and all about how you got interested in Rett syndrome.
Super. Thank you. So I am a speech language pathologist. I've been in the field for a long time. I always wanted to work with children who had challenges, and particularly found myself drawn to children with complex communication disorders such as autism, Down syndrome, and other issues. As I got older and I was working and started a family, my husband and I have 2 children, and our second child was born. We thought everything was fine. And when she was about 1, she started to regress. And we realized something was going on. And it was a long journey to find out really what was going on with her. But when she was 11 years old, we got the appropriate diagnosis because we were able to get genetic testing done at that time. And we learned that she had Rett syndrome. Rett syndrome is a complex disorder that affects multiple systems. Communication is pretty significantly affected in the population, and most individuals with Rett are nonverbal. So when my daughter was diagnosed and I looked for information on Rett, I couldn't find much. And the information that was available was limited, and it was negative, and it was saying things like the outcomes would be dire. And there really wasn't a lot of hope for change and growth and rehabilitation. So I kind of set on a course to learn more about Rett syndrome. And I knew that my daughter was communicating, not typically, but she was vocal. She could use AAC. And so I wanted to share information with the world. So I ended up doing my PhD on communication with Rett syndrome. And then over the years have worked in collaboration with a number of colleagues, had the opportunity to present all over the world. And now I do some consulting for the International Rett Syndrome Foundation on the topic of communication.
Well, I'm so excited to have you on today. It's definitely a topic area that we want to cover on this podcast. And I know there's a lot of listeners out there who perhaps have heard of Rett syndrome, but don't really understand a lot about it. So can you just share with our listeners a little bit about what you've learned? I know you have an amazing communication guidelines all for individuals with Rett syndrome. So just start off by telling your listeners, like, what is Rett syndrome? What characteristics does it have? And then, of course, how it impacts communication.
Okay, perfect. So Rett syndrome is an X-linked genetic mutation. So there is a mutation in a gene called MECP2, and this gene is critical for brain development. And it's on the X chromosome. So most of the individuals who have Rett syndrome are female. There are a number of males with Rett, but fewer than females. And often in the males, the condition can present as more serious, more complex, because males only have one X chromosome. Characteristics of Rett start to emerge somewhere within, say, the first year to year and a half of life. For many families, their infant is developing typically, might even start to walk, start to say some words, and then somewhere before, say, 18 months, start to experience a regression. So if they are talking, words are lost. If they are walking, they start to have gross motor problems. Some children never begin to walk. Some begin to have seizures. Seizures are common in Rett syndrome, as are respiratory difficulties, motor planning difficulties, such as apraxia, that affect the whole body. So it's a complex multi-system disorder that usually becomes evident and is becoming more appropriately diagnosed in younger children. There's also a characteristic hand wringing or hand clasping movement that we see in Rett syndrome. For many individuals with Rett, they're unable to use their hands functionally, again, secondary to that motor planning or apraxia problem. So that can be a hallmark of the disorder. They also have gastrointestinal problems. Some can eat by mouth, but many have to rely, say, on a G-tube or other means of feeding. So it really affects most of the systems in the body. We used to think a long time ago that individuals with Rett were incapable of intentional communication. We thought that their lives were shortened because we thought it was a degenerative disorder. But we now know that there are many individuals with Rett syndrome living well into and through middle age and into their senior years because they're getting good care, good nutrition, and we know so much more. And in addition, we have evidence that shows that individuals with Rett syndrome are capable of intentional communication. And the advances that have been made in AAC area have enabled individuals with Rett to really show what they know and what they can do. Many individuals with Rett, because they can't use their hands, find that the eye gaze modality is really the most effective modality. So we see a lot of individuals with Rett using AAC access through eye gaze, and that's really been a game changer.
Yeah, I mean, that technology just in general is pretty remarkable when you think about individuals who don't have motor control of most of their body, but if they have, the ability to use eye tracking, it just opens up a world of communication that they might not otherwise have. So it's just so cool when I zoom out for a second of my day to day and think about how far the technology has come and how really incredible it is, and how it just completely changes the lives of so many that otherwise wouldn't be able to access, with direct selection and things like that. So super excited about that. Tell me a little bit about the journey that you had with your daughter. What did that look like? Tell me a little bit about AAC and what that journey was like. We have a lot of parents who listen to this podcast, and it's helpful, I think, for parents who are just starting off on an AAC journey to hear from other parents about what their experience was like, what they've learned, what they would have done differently, things like that.
Sure. So, and again, remembering that Lisa didn't have the correct diagnosis till she was 11. When she was young, she was diagnosed as being autistic-like. And so we kind of went with that. So we did get her into early intervention. She was diagnosed before the age of 2. And so her therapist tried lots of strategies. At that point, they were still trying to work on oral speech because she had some words, but they were incorporating sign language. When we realized that her hands were not as functional as they could have been, she started to use some low-tech AAC in her preschool program. So she was doing picture communication books. We did try the PEC system a little bit, where you have to pull off the pictures and hand it to your partner so that you would get some good engagement. But that was too challenging for her motor-wise. Lisa is now 33 years old. So if we think back 30 years ago, the technology was so much simpler than it is now. But she did have some simple AAC devices that had voice output. A 4 square, she had 4 buttons and we put a picture on there. So her SLPs, I have to say, were pretty forward thinking and trying to have her introduced to AAC when she was younger. And we always worked on every modality. So we worked on pointing, we worked on vocalizing, we worked on eye gaze, and we also worked on AAC using direct selection. As she's gotten older, we've modified what she can do. My daughter's hand function is very preserved for somebody with Rett. So she can point to items on an iPad. So she uses right now TD Snap software on an iPad, and she can swipe, she can touch. She also can point, and she can also pick up objects and bring them to you, which is something that a lot of individuals with Rett syndrome really struggle with. She also vocalizes, and every once in a while it sounds like she has got a couple of words, and she shakes her head yes and no. So we use all of those modalities, and don't neglect any.
Yeah, I think that's a really important reminder too, is that we really need to be supporting individuals with all the different ways that they can communicate with us, and really honoring nonverbal communication and things like that. However, a student decides that they want to communicate with us, we can keep supporting. And I think that's a really important piece. I think sometimes we get so laser focused on the technology and use your system, but we know from listening to AAC users themselves, and many of them have been on this podcast, they oftentimes have multiple systems for communication, right? Multiple AAC systems. In this situation, I use this. In a different situation, I use that. So I think that's a really important reminder.
Yeah, I mean, something as simple as the yes/no cards, just having those available for her, asking her yes/no questions. One modality is not better than the other. And I think, sometimes people can become enamored of the high tech and think, oh, it has all this capability, that's the best. But again, I think we have to, like you said, go back to the user and look at the situations in which they find themselves, and what's their preferred communication modality in that particular setting, and then honor that.
Absolutely. Okay. Tell me a little bit about your communication guidelines. We kind of talked about, I feel like one of the hallmark characteristics communication wise is we have to consider potentially alternative access for individuals with Rett syndrome. What else should we know as speech language pathologists or educators about Rett syndrome when it comes to communication?
Thank you so much. I'm really proud and honored to be one of the co-authors of the Communication Guidelines for Rett Syndrome. They were published in 2020 by the International Rett Syndrome Foundation. And they came about because what we recognize, those of us in communication working with people with Rett syndrome, recognized that there was very little information available to families as well as professionals on how to advance communication in individuals with Rett syndrome. And this really was a global issue. I was at an international conference for Rett syndrome in Europe with colleagues from around the world, and we were having the same conversations. We were saying that when we worked with people with Rett syndrome, we were seeing them communicate intentionally. But when you looked in the literature, there was very little literature there that said, this is a possibility, go for AAC. And so clinicians, teachers, parents who are out in the community couldn't find information. And if they found information, a lot of it was negative and was saying that communication probably wasn't attainable. So myself and 3 other colleagues, 2 SLPs and an OT, one from Australia, one from the Netherlands, and one from Sweden. We started working together with a shared goal of trying to gather information so that we could help people get the best evidence on how to advance communication in Rett. And we were funded. We wrote a grant. We were funded by the International Rett Syndrome Foundation to develop the guidelines. And so this was a multi-year study, and we actually went through about 500 pieces of literature to find what is the best evidence, published evidence on communication in Rett. And because it was not a lot of very high quality, rigorous experimental studies, which is not atypical in a field like this because it's a rare disorder. It's really hard to do a clinical study. We found lots of what we call gray literature, lots of anecdotal case study, things like that. So we put all of that together, but then we said we need to reach out to the community. So we reached out to professionals all over the world, as well as parents. And we had thousands of professionals and parents participate in surveys that we gave asking about communication in individuals with Rett syndrome. And our surveys were translated into multiple languages for parents. And we were able to have all of this information pulled together. And then we had a panel of experts evaluate the statements that we wrote about communication in Rett. And the result is the first of its kind evidence-based guidelines on how to assess and then intervene for communication, to develop communication in Rett. So we're really proud of these guidelines. It's about 100-page workbook, essentially, or a handbook. And we've written it in a way so that the language is accessible to parents as well as professionals. And we've got some really key chapters. There's 8 chapters in the guidelines. And we begin by talking about best practices for assessment, for intervention, and for teams working together. And we view the individual with Rett syndrome as well as their family members as equal members of the team. So everybody has to work together. We also have a chapter on features of Rett syndrome, because we know that for many teachers and therapists, they might have one person with Rett syndrome in their school or on their caseload. And so we can't expect them to come fully equipped with all of this information on how Rett impacts communication. So we have this in this chapter. We cover all the different features of Rett syndrome, for example, the apraxia or the motor planning problems. And we talk about how those motor planning problems impact communication. And we do that for all of the key features of Rett syndrome, so that someone can really grab this, take a look at it and say, okay, now I see why this person is doing what they're doing. Because we see individuals with Rett syndrome often have difficulties maintaining good regulation of their bodies. Mm-hmm. So they go in and out of being either overstimulated or understimulated. So we help the reader recognize what those features of under or overstimulation could look like, how to help the person get back into a regulated state, and then how to assess their communication at that time. So we're really proud of that. We have a section on how can you really be a good communication partner. And then we talk about how best practices for assessment. We write very strongly about non-standardized assessment, assessing in the natural environment, assessing in multiple environments, and interviewing, key significant people in that person's life. And then we start with intervention, and we talk about low tech. So very basic, yes, no, establishing the best yes, all the way up to high-tech AAC and the possibilities of literacy.
Love it. Love it. I love literacy. We talk a lot about that on this podcast, and just giving access to individuals so that they have the ability to really be able to say whatever they want to say to whoever they want to say it to. This resource sounds really awesome. I'm just imagining a parent with a newly diagnosed child with Rett syndrome listening to this podcast and then finding these communication guidelines as really a great resource to share with their speech therapist and their team. Because as you mentioned, it's a very low incidence that we see in our clinical practice. Even myself, I've worked, I specialize in AAC, and I've worked with several students with Rett syndrome, but by no means would I say a lot. So it does become challenging to understand kind of what we're looking at and how that impacts the way that we treat and the way that we practice. So I'm just super excited that you guys came together and created that resource, and super excited. How can people access the resource who are interested in it?
Great. So the resource is available on the Rett Syndrome Foundation's website. So it's rettsyndrome.org. And I can give you the link to share with your audience. But if they just look up rettsyndrome.org for communication professionals or communication, the guidelines will come up. And the guidelines are available in two formats. You can order a print copy for $10, and that's really just to cover the cost of printing and mailing. Or you can download a PDF right from the website, again, for $10. So we really try to keep the price point low. It's all money going, it's all from the foundation. Nobody else is getting any money for it. And we want to keep the price point low so that we keep it readily accessible. But what we've done in addition to making the guidelines available on the website is that we know, a 100-page book can sometimes be a little overwhelming if you hand it to a teacher or a therapist and say, here, now read this and learn all about, my child. So what we've done is we've created a free 3-part webinar series that is available on Rett Syndrome's Foundation's website, as well as on their YouTube channel. And we have 3 just under 1 hour videos. And they go through what is Rett syndrome, the first one. What are the features of Rett syndrome that affect communication? The second one is on assessment, best practices. And then the third one's on intervention. And these are all free on the website. And professionals can take these courses, watch the videos. At the end of the video, they can get a link then to take a quiz, a short quiz, so they can earn a certificate, which gives them 1 professional development hour. So somebody could take all 3 courses for no charge, earn 3 professional development hours. And then once you've taken and passed all 3 quizzes, you'll get an invitation to join our moderated forum. So it's also free. We have a panel of experts in communication and education and Rett syndrome who are waiting to help teachers, therapists, speech therapists, OTs, assistive tech people who want more specific information, say, on their particular child or student. And they can join the forum now that they have this basic information, and they have access to these 10 U.S. Web experts who can really help them with everything from low tech to high tech to literacy, reading, everything.
That is so exciting. I mean, we're all looking for some great free CEUs as SLPs. So we'll definitely link to that in the show notes. I'll have you send me the links. Some of them I see you included on our with your bio. So I'm really excited to share all those amazing resources with everyone. Theresa, what's next for you? You're so active in the Rett community. You're doing such amazing things. Like, what's next in the world of Rett syndrome with you?
Well, we have a goal that we want every speech pathologist in the U.S. So our focus is the U.S., but I also work closely with my colleagues. Like I have a colleague in the UK. She works for Rett UK. And so we collaborate, So really we want to start here, but we want to impact every individual with Rett syndrome across the world. But my goal is that every speech language pathologist in the US will know what Rett syndrome is, because they will hear that word during their graduate training program, because I never heard it. And so we are making these guidelines available to US-based SLP graduate programs and giving them the information, telling them about those webinars, and offering this as a particular, say it could be a module in a graduate class on AAC. And we've been really excited. We've been adopted by several universities already. And so this is really a passion for me, so that a student can get out of school, start practicing. And if they encounter someone with Rett syndrome, I don't expect them to remember everything, but they'll say, hey, wait a minute, I heard about Rett syndrome. I know where to go now for information. And the other thing about the guidelines is that they're written in a way so that the principles that we talk about are applicable to so many other individuals with complex communication disorders. So someone can take this information and apply it to someone with Down syndrome, someone with autism, someone with Angelman syndrome, so any other challenge to communication, that someone has a challenge to communication or a complex communication disorder. So much of what we write about how to get started, how to advance, how to move from, how do you choose a small vocabulary? Do you choose a robust vocabulary? These are things that are just best practice for AAC across so many different diagnostic groups. So we're hoping to get these guidelines into to help other say low incidence disorders as well.
Yeah. And I think you're exactly right. How can we start with pre-service SLPs with the training that they get? Because I think, unfortunately, it's just so hard for students getting out of graduate school. Some don't even have courses in AAC, so they don't have any, learning around the topic. And it's such a big topic that's so necessary in, 2023 to have some understanding of, because so many students are benefiting from AAC and using it for communication. So I think that's a really admirable goal, to really start with pre-service SLPs, because we know that if we really get to clinicians before they're out in the world and we're shaping their minds on how to be the best possible speech language pathologists they can be, just knowing about Rett syndrome and other, low incidence disabilities, I think is such a good launching off point. And yeah, I'm excited to share this episode and excited for this resource to be available for people. And really excited that you were able to come on today, Theresa, and talk all about the work that you do. It's so amazing. And I'm super excited to share it out with everyone. This is such an important topic, and I feel like low incidence disabilities feel very overwhelming and daunting for many parents and clinicians and educators. And so the more information we have, the more power we have to make the right decisions and to really help individuals to the best of our abilities. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing all your wisdom.
I'm so happy to be here. I really want to thank you. I did want to mention one more thing. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you about it. Okay. Right. Before we go, Theresa, you have a podcast. So tell me all about your podcast.
Yes, I do. And I love podcasts, and yours is wonderful. So grateful to be on it. But in 2022, I launched a podcast for parents, because as a parent of a child with a disability, it can be very lonely. You can feel like you're the only one in your family or your circle or your community who's really experienced these kinds of challenges. And so I developed a podcast. It's called Safe Harbor, a podcast for parents of children with disabilities. And though I talk a little bit about my daughter on there, and I have had a couple of parents of children with Rett syndrome on there, it's not just for parents of children with Rett syndrome. I've had parent of a child with autism, parent of a child with Down syndrome on there, and hope to have lots of other areas represented. But what we talk about are things that we share in common, our lives and our challenges. But we also talk about what really has been wonderful about this. You look back and say, wow, how can that be wonderful? But you look as a parent and you see how your life has been changed and how in so many ways it has been enhanced. There are so many lessons that you have learned that have made your life richer, maybe perhaps made you look at the world in a little bit differently, maybe affects your values. So I look at it as something I would never change, and it's something that has made me a better person. And I've learned a lot from my daughter, who cannot talk.
Yeah. And I feel like it's sometimes some of the most challenging experiences we have in this life are the ones that promote the most growth and evolution in us. So it's always nice when you can kind of be grateful for the process, and even the hard times, you can kind of find the silver lining of how much growth and how much, inspiration, value it can add to your life, if that's the way you kind of choose to look at it. So I'm super excited to share your podcast, and sounds like an amazing resource for families. Like you said, it's so lonely, I think, especially initially with the diagnosis. There's a grieving period that often takes place where you're trying to figure out, like, what am I going to do? And what is this going to look like? And, that whole process can be really hard, especially if you're doing it alone. So that's the nice thing about technology, is we all can kind of share our stories and, blast them out onto the internet so they're accessible to all. 15 years ago, a parent who was just diagnosed with a child with Rett syndrome would have felt so lonely. And now they can find your podcast and all of the amazing resources that the Rett Syndrome Foundation has, and all of those things. So we're really lucky to be in the time that we're in right now.
I agree wholeheartedly. So again, thanks for the work that you do and putting all this information out there. It's so valuable for people.
Thank you so much, Theresa. It was so great having you on today. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Oh, my pleasure.
For Talking with Tech, I'm Rachel Madel, joined by Theresa Bartolotta. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.